Chapter 7. Their eyes followed her admiringly. They had no idea they had been snubbed. It was a disappointment, of course, to find she had forestalled them, and that they were not to have the happiness of preparing for her, of watching her face when she arrived and first saw everything. But there was still Mrs. Fisher. They would concentrate on Mrs. Fisher and would watch her face instead. Only, like everybody else, they would have preferred to watch Lady Caroline's. Perhaps then, as Lady Caroline had talked of breakfast, they had better begin by going and having it. For there was too much to be done that day to spend any more time gazing at the scenery. Servants to be interviewed, the house to be gone through and examined, and finally, Mrs. Fisher's room to be got ready and adorned. They waved their hands gaily at Lady Caroline, who seemed absorbed in what she saw and took no notice. And turning away, found the maid servant of the night before had come up silently behind them in cloth slippers with string soles. She was Francesca, the elderly parlor maid who had been with the owner. He had said for years, and whose presence made inventories unnecessary. And after wishing them good morning and hoping they had slept well, she told them breakfast was ready in the dining room on the floor below, and if they would follow her, she would read. They didn't understand a single word of the very many in which Francesca succeeded in clothing this simple information. But they follow her, for it at least was clear that they were to follow, and going down the stairs and along the broad hall like the one above, except for glass doors at the end, instead of a window opening into the garden. They were shown into the dining room, where, sitting at the head of the table, having her breakfast, was Mrs. Fisher. This time they exclaimed. Even Mrs. Arbuthnot exclaimed, though her exclamation was only, "Oh." Mrs. Wilkins exclaimed at greater length, "Why, but it's like having the bread taken out of one's mouth," exclaimed Mrs. Wilkins. "How do you do?" said Mrs. Fisher. "I can't get up because of my stick." And she stretched out her hand across the table. They advanced and shook it. "We had no idea you were here," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Yes," said Mrs. Fisher, resuming her breakfast. "Yes, I am here." And with composure, she removed the top of her egg. "It's a great disappointment," said Mrs. Wilkins. "We had meant to give you such a welcome." This was the one Mrs. Fisher remembered, briefly glancing at her, who when she came to Prince of Wales Terrace said she had seen Keith. She must be careful with this one. Curb her from the beginning. She therefore ignored Mrs. Wilkins and said gravely, with a downward face of impenetrable calm bent on her egg, "Yes, I arrived yesterday with Lady Caroline." "It's really dreadful," said Mrs. Wilkins, exactly as if she had not been ignored. "There's nobody left to get anything ready for now. I feel forwarded. I feel as if the bread had been taken out of my mouth, just when I was going to be happy swallowing it." "Where will you sit?" asked Mrs. Fisher of Mrs. Arbuthnot, markedly of Mrs. Arbuthnot. The comparison with the bread seemed to her most unpleasant. "Oh, thank you," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, sitting down rather suddenly next to her. There were only two places she could sit down in, the places laid on either side of Mrs. Fisher. She therefore sat down in one, and Mrs. Wilkins sat down opposite her in the other. Mrs. Fisher was at the head of the table. Round her was grouped the coffee and the tea. Of course, they were all sharing San Salvatore equally. But it was she herself and Lotty, Mrs. Arbuthnot mildly reflected, who had found it, who had had the work of getting it, who had chosen to admit Mrs. Fisher into it. Without Ben, she could not help thinking Mrs. Fisher would not have been there. Morally, Mrs. Fisher was a guest. There was no hostess in this party. But supposing there had been a hostess, it would not have been Mrs. Fisher, nor Lady Caroline. It would have been either herself or Lotty. Mrs. Arbuthnot could not help feeling this as she sat down, and Mrs. Fisher, the hand which Weskin had wrung suspended over the pots before her, inquired, tea or coffee? She could not help feeling it even more definitely. And Mrs. Fisher touched a small gong on the table beside her as though she had been used to that gong and that table ever since she was little. And on Francesca's appearing bade her in the language of Dante bring more milk. There was a curious air about Mrs. Fisher, thought Mrs. Arbuthnot, of being in possession. And if she herself had not been so happy, she would have perhaps minded. Mrs. Wilkins noticed it too, but it only made her discursive brain think of cuckoos. She would no doubt immediately have begun to talk of cuckoos incoherently, unrestrainably, and deploredly, if she had been in the condition of nerves and shyness she was in last time she saw Mrs. Fisher. But happiness had done away with shyness. She was very serene. She could control her conversation. She did not have, horrified, to listen to herself saying things she had no idea of saying when she began. She was quite at her ease and completely natural. The disappointment of not going to be able to repair a welcome for Mrs. Fisher had evaporated at once, for it was impossible to go on being disappointed in heaven. Nor did she mind her behaving as hostess. What did it matter? You did not mind things in heaven. She and Mrs. Arbuthnot, therefore, sat down more willingly than they otherwise would have done, one on either side of Mrs. Fisher. And the sun, pouring through the two windows facing east across the bay, flooded the room, and there was an open door leading into the garden. And the garden was full of many lovely things, especially freesias. The delicate and delicious fragrance of the freesias came in through the door and floated round Mrs. Wilkins's enraptured nostrils. Freesias in London were quite beyond her. Occasionally, she went into a shop and asked what they cost, so as just to have an excuse for lifting up her bunch and smelling them, though knowing that it was something awful like a shilling for about 3 flowers. Here they were everywhere, bursting out of every corner and carpeting the rose beds. Imagine it, having freesias to pick an armful if you wanted to, and with glorious sunshine flooding the room, and in your summer frock, and it's being only the 1st of April. I suppose you realize, don't you, that we've got to heaven, she said, beaming at Mrs. Fisher with all the familiarity of a fellow angel. They are considerably younger than I had supposed, thought Mrs. Fisher, and not nearly so plain. And she mused a moment, while she took no notice of Mrs. Wilkins' exuberance. On their instant and agitated refusal that day at Prince of Wales Terrace to have anything to do with the giving or the taking of references. Nothing could affect her, of course. Nothing that anybody did. She was far too solidly seated in respectability. At her back stood massively in a tremendous row those 3 great names she had offered, and they were not the only ones she could turn to for support and countenance. Even if these young women, she had no grounds for believing the one out in the garden to be really Lady Caroline Dester. She had merely been told that she was. Even if these young women should all turn out to be what Browning used to call. How well she remembered his amusing and delightful way of putting things, fly-by nights. What could it possibly, or in any way, matter to her? Let them fly by night if they wished. One was not 65 for nothing. In any case, there would only be 4 weeks of it, at the end of which she would see no more of them. And in the meanwhile, there were plenty of places where she could sit quietly away from them and remember. Also, there was her own sitting room, a charming room, all honey-colored furniture and pictures, with windows to the sea towards Genoa, and a door opening onto the battlements. The house possessed 2 sitting rooms, and she had explained to that pretty creature, Lady Caroline, certainly a pretty creature, whatever else she was. Tennyson would have enjoyed taking her for blows on the downs, who had seemed inclined to appropriate the honey-colored one, that she needed some little refuge entirely to herself because of her stick. Nobody wants to see an old woman hobbling about everywhere, she had said. I shall be quite content to spend much of my time by myself in here, or sitting out on these convenient battlements. And she had a very nice bedroom, too. It looked 2 ways, across the bay to the morning sun. She liked the morning sun and onto the garden. There were only 2 of these bedrooms with cross views in the house, she and Lady Caroline had discovered, and they were by far the airiest. They each had 2 beds in them, and she and Lady Caroline had had the extra beds taken out at once and put into 2 of the other rooms. In this way, there was much more space and comfort. Lady Caroline, indeed, had turned hers into a bed-sitting room, with the sofa out of the bigger drawing room and the writing table and the most comfortable chair. But she herself had not had to do that because she had her own sitting room, equipped with what was necessary. Lady Caroline had thought at first of taking the bigger sitting room entirely for her own, because the dining room on the floor below could quite well be used between meals to sit in by the 2 others, and was a very pleasant room with nice chairs. But she had not liked the bigger sitting room shape. It was a round room in the tower, with deep slit windows pierced through the massive walls, and a domed and ribbed ceiling arranged to look like an open umbrella. And it seemed a little dark. Undoubtedly, Lady Caroline had cast covetous glances at the honey-colored room, and if she, Mrs. Fisher, had been less firm, would have installed herself in it, which would have been such absurd. I hope, said Mrs. Arbuthnot, smilingly making an attempt to convey to Mrs. Fisher that though she, Mrs. Fisher, might not be exactly a guest, she certainly was not, in the very least, a hostess. Your room is comfortable. Quite, said Mrs. Fisher. Will you have some more coffee? No, thank you. Will you? No, thank you. There were 2 beds in my bedroom, filling it up unnecessarily, and I had one taken out. It has made it much more convenient. Oh, that's why I've got 2 beds in my room, exclaimed Mrs. Wilkins, illuminated. The second bed in her little cell had seemed an unnatural and inappropriate object because she saw it. She saw it. I gave no directions, said Miss Fisher, addressing Mrs. Arbuthnot. I nearly asked Francesca to remove it. I have 2 in my room as well, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. Your second one must be Lady Caroline's. She had hers removed too, said Mrs. Fisher. It seems foolish to have more beds in a room than there are occupiers. But we haven't got any husbands here either, said Mrs. Wilkins. And I don't see any use in extra beds in one's room if one hasn't got husbands to put in them. Can't we have them taken away too? Beds, said Mrs. Fisher coldly, cannot be removed from one room after another. They must remain somewhere. Mrs. Wilkins' remarks seemed to Mrs. Fisher persistently unfortunate. Each time she opened her mouth, she said something best left unsaid. Loose talk about husbands had never in Mrs. Fisher's circle been encouraged. In the 80s, when she chiefly flourished, husbands were taken seriously as the only real obstacles to sin. Beds, too, if they had to be mentioned, were approached with caution. And a decent reserve prevented them and husbands ever being spoken of in the same breath. She turned more markedly than ever to Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Do let me give you a little more coffee," she said. "No, thank you. But won't you have some more?" "No, indeed. I never have more than 2 cups at breakfast. Would you like an orange?" "No, thank you." "Would you?" "No, I don't eat fruit at breakfast. It is an American fashion, which I am too old now to adopt." "Have you had all you want?" "Quite. Have you?" Mrs. Fisher paused before replying. Was this a habit? This trick of answering a simple question with the same question? If so, it must be curbed, for no one could live for 4 weeks in any real comfort with somebody who had a habit. She glanced at Mrs. Arbuthnot, and her parted hair and gentle brow reassured her. No, it was accident, not habit, that had produced those echoes. Then she could as soon imagine a dove having tiresome habits as Mrs. Arbuthnot. Considering her, she thought what a splendid wife she would have been for poor Carlyle. So much better than that horrid, clever Jane. He would have soothed him. "Then shall we go?" "Let me help you up," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "All consideration." "Oh, thank you. I can manage perfectly. It's only sometimes that my stick prevents me." Mrs. Fisher got up quite easily. Mrs. Arbuthnot had hovered over her for nothing. "I'm going to have one of these gorgeous oranges," said Mrs. Wilkins, staying where she was and reaching across to a black bowl piled with them. "Rose, how can you resist them? Look, have this one. Do have this beauty." And she held out a big one. "No, I'm going to see to my duties," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, moving towards the door. "You'll forgive me for leaving you, won't you?" she added politely to Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher moved towards the door, too, quite easily, almost quickly. Her stick did not hinder her at all. She had no intention of being left with Mrs. Wilkins. "What time would you like to have lunch?" Mrs. Arbuthnot asked her, trying to keep her head as at least a non-guest, if not precisely a hostess, above water. "Lunch," said Mrs. Fisher, "is at 12:30. "You shall have it at 12:30, then," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "I'll tell the cook. It will be a great struggle," she continued, smiling, "but I've brought a little dictionary." "The cook," said Mrs. Fisher Mouse. "Oh?" "And it would be," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Lady Caroline has already told her," said Mrs. Fisher. "Oh," said Mrs. Arbuthnot again. "Yes. Lady Caroline speaks the kind of Italian cooks understand. I am prevented going into the kitchen because of my stick. And even if I were able to go, I fear I shouldn't be understood." But began Mrs. Arbuthnot. "But it's too wonderful." Mrs. Wilkins finished for her from the table, delighted with these unexpected simplifications in her and Rose's lives. "Why, we've got positively nothing to do here, either of us," except just be happy. You wouldn't believe, she said, turning her head and speaking straight to Mrs. Fisher, portions of orange in either hand, how terribly good Rose and I have been for years without stopping, and how much now we need a perfect rest. And Mrs. Fisher, going without answering her out of the room, said to herself, she shall be cured. Chapter 8. Presently, when Mrs. Wilkins and Mrs. Arbuthnot, unhampered by any duties, wandered out and down the worn stone steps and under the pergola into the lower garden, Mrs. Wilkins said to Mrs. Arbuthnot, who seemed pensive, "Don't you see that if somebody else does the ordering it frees us?" Mrs. Arbuthnot said she did see, but nevertheless she thought it rather silly to have everything taken out of their hands. "I love things to be taken out of my hands," said Mrs. Wilkins. "But we found San Salvatore, become a book found," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, "and it is rather silly that Mrs. Fisher should behave as if it belonged only to her." "What is rather silly," said Mrs. Wilkins with much serenity, "is to mind. I can't see the least point in being an authority at the price of one's liberty." Mrs. Arbuthnot said nothing to that for two reasons. First, because she was struck by the remarkable and growing calm of the hitherto incoherent and excited Lotty. And secondly, because what she was looking at was so very beautiful. All down the stone steps on either side were periwinkles in full flower, and she could now see what it was that had caught at her the night before, and brushed, wet and scented, across her face. It was wisteria. Wisteria and sunshine. She remembered the advertisement. Here indeed were both in profusion. The wisteria was tumbling over itself in its excess of life, its prodigality of flowering. And where the pergola ended, the sun blazed on scarlet geraniums, bushes of them, and nasturtiums in great heaps, and marigolds so brilliant that they seemed to be burning, and red and pink snapdragons, all outdoing each other in bright, fierce color. The ground behind these flaming things dropped away in terraces to the sea. Each terrace a little orchard, where among the olives grew vines on trellises, and fig trees, and peach trees, and cherry trees. The cherry trees and peach trees were in blossom, lovely showers of light and deep rose color along the trembling delicacy of the olives. The fig leaves were just big enough to smell figs. The vine buds were only beginning to show. And beneath these trees were groups of blue and purple irises, and bushes of lavender, and gray, sharp cactuses. And the grass was thick with dandelions and daisies, and right down at the bottom was the sea. Color seemed flung down, anyhow, anywhere. Every sort of color piled up in heaps, pouring along in rivers. The periwinkles looked exactly as if they were being poured down each side of the steps. And flowers that grow only in borders, in proud flowers keeping themselves to themselves over there, such as the great blue irises and the lavender, were being jostled by small, shining common things, like dandelions and daisies, and the white bells of the wild onion, and only seemed the better and the more exuberant for it. They stood looking at this crowd of loveliness, this happy jumble, in silence. No, it didn't matter what Mrs. Fisher did. Not here. Not in such beauty. But Mrs. Arbuthnot's discomposure melted out of her, in the warmth and light of what she was looking at, of what to her was a manifestation, an entirely new side of God. How could one be discomposed? If only Frederick were with her, seeing it too, seeing as he would have seen it when first they were lovers, in the days when he saw what she saw and loved what she loved. She sighed. "You mustn't sigh in heaven," said Mrs. Wilkins. "One doesn't. I was thinking how one longs to share this with those one loves," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "And you mustn't long in heaven," said Mrs. Wilkins. "You're supposed to be quite complete there. And it is heaven, isn't it, Rose? See how everything's been let in together. The dandelions and the irises, the vulgar and the superior. Me and Mrs. Fisher, all welcome, all mixed up anyhow, and also visibly happy and enjoying ourselves." "Mrs. Fisher doesn't seem happy, not visibly anyhow," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, smiling. "She'll begin soon, you'll see." Mrs. Arbuthnot said she didn't believe that after a certain age, people began anything. Mrs. Wilkins said she was sure no one, however old and tough, could resist the effects of perfect beauty. Before many days, perhaps only hours, they would see Mrs. Fisher bursting out into every kind of exuberance. "I'm quite sure," said Mrs. Wilkins, "that we've got to heaven. And once Mrs. Fisher realizes that that's where she is, she's bound to be different. You'll see. She'll leave off being ossified and go all soft and able to stretch, and we shall get quite... Why, I shouldn't be surprised if we get quite fond of her." The idea of Mrs. Fisher bursting out into anything, she who seemed so particularly firmly fixed inside her buttons, made Mrs. Arbuthnot laugh. She condoned Lotty's loose way of talking of heaven, because in such a place on such a morning, condemnation was in the very air. Besides, what an excuse there was. And Lady Caroline, sitting where they had left her before breakfast on the wall, peeped over when she heard laughter and saw them standing on the path below, and thought what a mercy it was they were laughing down there, and had not come up and done it round her. She disliked jokes at all times, but in the morning she hated them, especially close up, especially crowding in her ears. She hoped the originals were on their way out for a walk, and not on their way back from one. They were laughing more and more. What could they possibly find to laugh at? She looked down on the tops of their heads with a very serious face, for the thought of spending a month with laughers was a grave one. And they, as though they felt her eyes, turned suddenly and looked up. The dreadful geniality of those women. She shrank away from their smiles and wavings, but she could not shrink out of sight without falling into the lilies. She neither smiled or waved back, and turning her eyes to the more distant mountains, surveyed them carefully till the two, tired of waving, moved away along the path and turned the corner and disappeared. This time they both did notice that they had been met with, at least, unresponsiveness. "If we weren't in heaven," said Mrs. Wilkins serenely, "I should say we had been snubbed, but as nobody snubs anybody there, of course we can't have been. Perhaps she is unhappy," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Whatever it is she is, she'll get over it here," said Mrs. Wilkins with conviction. "We must try and help her," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Oh, but nobody helps anybody in heaven. That's finished with. You don't try to be or do. You simply are." Well, Mrs. Arbuthnot wouldn't go into that. Not here, not today. The vicar, she knew, would have called Lotty's talk levity, if not profanity. How old he seemed from here. An old, old vicar. They left the path, and clamber down the olive terraces, down and down, to where at the bottom the warm, sleepy sea heaved gently among the rocks, where a pine tree grew close to the water, and they sat under it, and a few yards away was a fishing boat lying motionless and green-bellied on the water. The ripples of the sea made little gurgling noises at their feet. They screwed up their eyes to be able to look into the blaze of light beyond the shade of their tree. The hot smell from the pine needles and from the cushions of wild thyme that padded the spaces between the rocks. And sometimes a smell of pure honey from a clump of warm irises up behind them in the sun puffed across their faces. Very soon, Mrs. Wilkins took her shoes and stockings off and let her feet hang in the water. After watching her a minute, Mrs. Arbuthnot did the same. Their happiness was then complete. Their husbands would not have known them. They left off talking. They ceased to mention heaven. They were just cups of acceptance. Meanwhile, Lady Caroline on her wall was considering her position. The garden on the top of the wall was a delicious garden, but its situation made it insecure and exposed to interruptions. At any moment, the others might come and want to use it, because both the hall and the dining room had doors opening straight into it. Perhaps, felt Lady Caroline, she could arrange that it should be solely hers. Mrs. Fisher had the battlements, delightful with flowers, and a watchtower all to herself, besides having snatched the one really nice room in the house. There were plenty of places the originals could go to. She had herself seen at least 2 other little gardens, while the hill the castle stood on was itself a garden with walks. Why should not this one spot be kept exclusively for her? She liked it. She liked it best of all. It had the Judas tree and an umbrella pine. It had the freesias and the lilies. It had a tamarisk beginning to flush pink. It had the convenient low wall to sit on. It had, from each of its 3 sides, the most amazing views. To the east, the bay and the mountains. To the north, the village across the tranquil, clear green water of the little harbor, and the hills dotted with white houses and orange groves. And to the west was the thin thread of land by which San Salvatore was tied to the mainland. And then the open sea and the coastline beyond Genoa, reaching away into the blue dimness of France. Yes, she would say she wanted to have this entirely to herself. How obviously sensible. If each of them had their own special place to sit in apart, it was essential to her comfort that she should be able to be apart, left alone, not talked to. The others ought to like it best too. Why heard? One had enough of that in England with one's relations and friends. Oh, the numbers of them, pressing on one continually. Having successfully escaped them for 4 weeks while building a cross department, and with persons having no earthly claim on one, to herd, she lit a cigarette. She began to feel secure. Those 2 had gone for a walk. There was no sign of Mrs. Fisher. How very pleasant this was. Somebody came out through the glass doors just as she was drawing a deep breath of security. Surely it couldn't be Mrs. Fisher wanting to sit with her. Mrs. Fisher had her battlements. She had to stay on them, having snatched them. It would be too tiresome if she wouldn't, and wanted not only to have them and her sitting room, but to establish herself in this garden as well. No, it wasn't Mrs. Fisher. It was the cook She frowned. Was she gonna have to go on ordering the food? Surely, one or other of those two waiting women would do that now. The cook, who had been waving in increasing agitation in the kitchen, watching the clock getting nearer to lunchtime, while she still was without knowledge of what lunch was to consist of, had gone at last to Mrs. Fisher, who had immediately waved her away. She then wandered about the house, seeking a mistress, any mistress, who would tell her what to cook, and finding none. And at last, directed by Francesca, who always knew where everybody was, came out to Lady Caroline. Domenico had provided this cook. She was Costanza, the sister of that one of his cousins who kept the restaurant down on the piazza. She helped her brother in his cooking when she had no other job and knew every sort of fat, mysterious Italian dish, such as the workmen of Castagneto, who crowded the restaurant at midday, and the inhabitants of Mezzago, when they came over on Sundays, loved to eat. She was a fleshless spinster of 50, gray-haired, nimble, rich of speech, and thought Lady Caroline more beautiful than anyone she had ever seen. And so did Domenico. And so did the boy Giuseppe, who helped Domenico, and was, besides, his nephew. And so did the girl Angela, who helped Francesca, and was, besides, Domenico's niece. And so did Francesca herself. Poor Domenico and Francesca, the only two who had seen them, thought the two ladies who arrived last very beautiful, though compared to the fair young lady who arrived first, they were as candles to the electric light that had lately been installed, and as the tin tubs in the bedrooms to the wonderful new bathroom their master had arranged on his last visit. Lady Caroline scowled at the cook. The scowl, as usual, was transformed on the way into what appeared to be an intent and beautiful gravity. And Costanza threw up her hands and took the saints aloud to witness that here was the very picture of the Mother of God. Lady Caroline asked her crossly what she wanted, and Costanza's head went on one side, with delight at the sheer music of her voice. She said, after waiting a moment, in case the music was going to continue, for she didn't wish to miss any of it, that she wanted orders. She had been to the signorina's mother, but in vain. "She's not my mother," repudiated Lady Caroline angrily. Her anger sounded like the regretful wail of a melodious orphan. Costanza poured forth pity. She too, Hugh explained, had no mother. Lady Caroline interrupted with the curt information that her mother was alive and in London. Costanza praised God and the saints that the young lady did not yet know what it was like to be without a mother. Quickly enough did misfortunes overtake one. No doubt the young lady already had a husband. "No," said Lady Caroline Elizabeth. Worse than jokes in the morning, did she hate the idea of husbands. And everybody was always trying to press them on her. All her relations, all her friends, all the evening papers. After all, she could only marry one, anyhow. But you would think, from the way everybody talked, and especially those persons who wanted to be husbands, that she could marry at least a dozen. Her soft, pathetic "no" made Costanza, who was standing close to her, well, with sympathy. "Poor little one," said Costanza, moved actually to pat her encouragingly on the shoulder. "Take hope. There's still time." "For lunch," said Lady Caroline freezingly, marveling as she spoke that she should be patted. She had taken so much trouble to come to a place remote and hidden, where she could be sure that among other things of a like oppressive nature, paddings also were not. "We will have." Costanza became businesslike. She interrupted with suggestions, and her suggestions were all admirable and all expensive. Lady Caroline did not know they were expensive and fell in with them at once. They sounded very nice. Every sort of young vegetables and fruits came into them, and much butter, and a great deal of cream, and incredible numbers of eggs. Costanza said enthusiastically at the end, as a tribute to this acquiescence, that of the many ladies and gentlemen she had worked for on temporary jobs such as this, she preferred the English ladies and gentlemen. She more than preferred them. They roused devotion in her, for they knew what to order. They did not skip. They refrained from grinding down the faces of the poor. From this lady, Caroline concluded that she had been extravagant and promptly countermanded the cream. Costanza's face fell, for she had a cousin who had a cow, and the cream was to have come from them both. "And perhaps we had better not have chickens," said Lady Caroline. Costanza's face fell more, for her brother at the restaurant kept chickens in his backyard, and many of them were ready for killing. "Also, do not order strawberries till I have consulted with the other ladies," said Lady Caroline, remembering that it was only the 1st of April, and that perhaps people who lived in Hampstead might be poor. Indeed, must be poor, or why live in Hampstead? "It is not I who am mistress here." "Is it the old one?" asked Costanza, her face very long. "Think of that." "No," said Lady Caroline. "Which of the other two ladies is it?" "Neither," said Lady Caroline. Then Costanza's smiles returned, for the young lady was having fun with her and making jokes. She told her so, in her friendly Italian way, and was genuinely delighted. "I never make jokes," said Lady Caroline briefly. "You had better go, or lunch will certainly not be ready by 12:30. And these curt words came out sounding so sweet that Costanza felt as if kind compliments were being paid her, and forgot her disappointment about the cream and the chickens, and went away all gratitude and smiles. This, thought Lady Caroline, will never do. I haven't come here to housekeep, and I won't. She called Costanza back. Costanza came running. The sound of her name in that voice enchanted her. "I have ordered the lunch for today," said Lady Caroline, with the serious angel face that was hers when she was annoyed. "And I have also ordered the dinner, but from now on, you will go to one of the other ladies for orders. I give no more." The idea that she would go on giving orders was too absurd. She never gave orders at home. Nobody there dreamed of asking her to do anything. But such a very tiresome activity should be thrust upon her here, simply because she happened to be able to talk Italian. It was ridiculous. Let the originals give orders if Mrs. Fisher refused to. Mrs. Fisher, of course, was the one nature intended for such a purpose. She had the very air of a competent housekeeper. Her clothes were the clothes of a housekeeper, and so was the way she did her hair, having delivered herself of her ultimatum with an affability that turned sweet on the way, and accompanied it by a peremptory gesture of dismissal that had the grace and loving kindness of a benediction. It was annoying that Costanza should only stand still with her head on one side, gazing at her in obvious delight. "Oh, go away," exclaimed Lady Caroline in English, suddenly exasperated. There had been a fly in her bedroom that morning, which had stuck just as Costanza was sticking. Only one, but it might have been a myriad. It was so tiresome from daylight on. It was determined to settle on her face, and she was determined it should not. Its persistence was uncanny. It woke her and would not let her go to sleep again. She hit at it, and it eluded her without fuss or effort, and with an almost visible blandness, and she had only hit herself. It came back again, instantly, and with a loud buzz, alighted on her cheek. She hit at it again, and hurt herself, while it skimmed gracefully away. She lost her temper, and sat up in bed, and waited, watching to hit at it, and kill it. She kept on hitting at it, at last, with fury, and with all her strength, as if it were a real enemy, deliberately trying to madden him. And it elegantly skimmed in and out of her blows, not even angry, to be back again the next instant. It succeeded every time in getting onto her face, and was quite indifferent how often it was driven away. And that was why she had dressed and come out so early. Francesca had already been told to put a net over her bed, for she was not going to allow herself to be annoyed twice like that. People were exactly like flies. She wished there were nets for keeping them off too. She hit at them with words and frowns, and like the fly, they slipped between her blows and were untouched. Worse than the fly, they seemed unaware that she had even tried to hit them. The flying at least did for a moment go away. With human beings, the only way to get rid of them was to go away herself. That was what? So tired she had done this April. And having got here, having got close up to the details of life at San Salvatore, it appeared that here too she was not to be let alone. Viewed from London, there had seemed to be no details. San Salvatore from there seemed to be an empty but delicious blank. Yet, after only 24 hours of it, she was discovering that it was not a blank at all, and that she was having to ward off as actively as ever. Already she had been much stuck too. Mrs. Fisher had stuck nearly the whole of the day before, and this morning there had been no peace, about 10 minutes, uninterruptedly alone. Costanza, of course, had finally to go, because she had to cook. But hardly had she gone before Domenico came. He came to water and tie up. That was natural, since he was the gardener. But he watered and tied up all the things that were nearest to her. He hovered closer and closer. He watered to excess. He tied plants that were as straight and steady as arrows. Well, at least he was a man, and therefore not quite so annoying, and his smiling good morning was received with an answering smile, upon which Domenico forgot his family, his wife, his mother, his grown-up children, and all his duties, and only wanted to kiss the young lady's feet. He could not do that, unfortunately, but he could talk while he worked, and talk he did, voluminously, pouring out every kind of information, illustrating what he said with gestures so lively that he had to put down the watering pot, and thus delay the end of the watering. Lady Caroline bore it for a time, but presently was unable to bear it. And as he would not go, and she could not tell him to, seeing that he was engaged in his proper work, once again it was she who had to. She got off the wall and moved to the other side of the garden, where in a wooden shed were some comfortable low cane chairs. All she wanted was to turn one of these round with its back to Domenico, and its front to the sea towards Genoa, Such a little thing to want. One would have thought she might have been allowed to do that unmolested. But he, who watched her every movement, when he saw her approaching the chairs, darted after her, and seized one and asked to be told where to put it. Would she never get away from being waited on, being made comfortable, being asked where she wanted things put, having to say thank you? She was short with Domenico, who instantly concluded that the sun had given her a headache, and ran in and fetched her a sunshade and a cushion and a footstool, and was skillful, and was wonderful. She shut her eyes in a heavy resignation. She could not be unkind to Domenico. She could not get up and walk indoors as she would have done if it had been one of the others. Domenico was intelligent and very competent. She had at once discovered that it was he who really ran the house, who really did everything. And his manners were definitely delightful. And he undoubtedly was a charming person. It was only that she did so much long to be let alone. If only she could be left quite quiet for this 1 month, she felt that she might perhaps make something of herself after all. She kept her eyes shut, because then he would think she wanted to sleep and would go away. Domenico's romantic Italian soul melted within him at the sight, for having her eyes shut was extraordinarily becoming to her. He stood entranced quite still, and she thought he had stolen away, so she opened them again. No, there he was, staring at her. Even he. There was no getting away from being stared. I have a headache, she said, shutting them again. It is the sun, said Domenico, and sitting on the wall without a hat. I wish to sleep. Si, signorina, he said sympathetically, and went softly away. She opened her eyes with a sigh of relief. The gentle closing of the glass doors showed her that he had not only gone quite away, but had shut her out in the garden so that she should be undisturbed. Now perhaps she would be alone till lunchtime. It was very curious, and no one in the world could have been more surprised than she herself. But, she wanted to think, she had never wanted to do that before. Everything else that it is possible to do without too much inconvenience she had wanted to do or had done at one period or another of her life. But not before had she wanted to think. She had come to San Salvatore with the single intention of lying comatose for 4 weeks in the sun, somewhere where her parents and friends were not, lapped in forgetfulness, stirring herself only to be fed. And she had not been there more than a few hours when this strange new desire took hold of her. There had been wonderful stars the evening before, and she had gone out into the top garden after dinner, leaving Mrs. Fisher alone over her nuts and wine, and sitting on the wall at the place where the lilies crowded their ghost heads. She had looked out into the gulf of the night, and it had suddenly seemed as if her life had been a noise, all about nothing. She had been intensely surprised. She knew stars and darkness did produce unusual emotions, because in others she had seen them being produced, but they had not before done it in herself. A noise, all about nothing. Could she be quite well? She had wondered. For a long while past, she had been aware that her life was a noise, but it had seemed to be very much about something. A noise indeed about so much that she felt she must get out of earshot for a little, or she would be completely, and perhaps permanently, deafened. But suppose it was only a noise about nothing. She had not had a question like that in her mind before. It had made her feel lonely. She wanted to be alone, but not lonely. That was very different. That was something that ate and hurt dreadfully right inside one. It was what one dreaded most. It was what made one go to so many parties. And lately, even the parties had seemed once or twice not to be a perfectly certain protection. Was it possible that loneliness had nothing to do with circumstances, but only with the way one met them? Perhaps she had thought she had better go to bed. She couldn't be very well. She went to bed, and in the morning, after she had escaped the fly and had her breakfast and got out again into the garden, there was the same feeling again, and in broad daylight. Once more, she had that really rather disgusting suspicion that her life till now had not only been loud but empty. Well, if that were so, and if her first 28 years, the best ones, had gone just in meaningless noise, she had better stop a moment and look round her, pause, as they said in tiresome novels, and consider. She hadn't got many sets of 28 years. One more would see her growing, very like Mrs. Fisher. 2 more. She averted her eyes. Her mother would have been concerned if she had known. Her mother doted. Her father would have been concerned too, for he also doted. Everybody doted. And when, melodiously obstinate, she had insisted on going off to entomb herself in Italy for a whole month with queer people she had got out of an advertisement, refusing even to take her maid, the only explanation her friends could imagine was that poor Scrap, such was her name among them, had overdone it and was feeling a little nervy. Her mother had been distressed at her departure. It was such an odd thing to do, such a sign of disappointment. She encouraged the general idea of the verge of a nervous breakdown. If she could have seen her adored Scrap, more delightful to look upon than any other mother's daughter had ever yet been, the object of her utmost pride, the source of all her fondest hopes, sitting staring at the empty noonday Mediterranean, considering her 3 possible sets of 20, she would have been miserable. To go away alone was bad. To think was worse. No good could come out of the thinking of a beautiful young woman. Complications could come out of it in profusion, but no good. The thinking of the beautiful was bound to result in hesitations, in reluctances, in unhappiness all round. And here, if she could have seen her, sat her Scrap thinking quite hard. And such things. Such old things. Things nobody ever began to think till they were at least 40. Chapter 9. That one of the 2 sitting rooms, which Mrs. Fisher had taken for her own, was a room of charm and character. She surveyed it with satisfaction on going into it after breakfast, and was glad it was hers. It had a tile floor, and walls the color of pale honey, and inlaid furniture the color of amber, and mellow books, many in ivory or lemon-colored covers. There was a big window overlooking the sea towards Genoa, and a glass door through which she could proceed out onto the battlements, and walk along past the quaint and attractive watchtower, in itself a room with chairs and a writing table, to where on the other side of the tower the battlements ended in a marble seat, and one could see the western bay and the point round which began the Gulf of Spezia. Her south view, between these 2 stretches of sea, was another hill, higher than San Salvatore, the last of the little peninsula, with the bland turrets of a smaller and uninhabited castle on the top, on which the setting sun still shone when everything else was sunk in shadow. Yes, she was very comfortably established here. And receptacles? Mrs. Fisher did not examine their nature closely, but they seemed to be small stone troughs, or perhaps little sarcophagi ringed around the battlements with flowers. These battlements, she thought, considering them, would have been a perfect place for her to pace up and down gently in moments when she least felt the need of her stick, or to sit in on the marble seat, having first put a cushion on it, if there had not unfortunately been a second glass door opening onto them, destroying their complete privacy, spoiling her feeling that the place was only for her. The second door belonged to the round drawing room, which both she and Lady Caroline had rejected as too dark. That room would probably be sat in by the women from Hampstead, and she was afraid they would not confine themselves to sitting in it, but would come out through the glass door and invade her battlements. This would ruin the battlements. It would ruin them as far as she was concerned if they were to be overrun. Or even if not actually overrun, they were liable to be raked by the eyes of persons inside the room. No one could be perfectly at ease if they were being watched and knew it. What she wanted, what she surely had a right to, was privacy. She had no wish to intrude on the others. Why then should they intrude on her? And she could always relax her privacy if, when she became better acquainted with her companions, she should think it worthwhile. But she doubted whether any of the three would so develop as to make her think it worthwhile. Hardly anything was really worthwhile, reflected Mrs. Fisher, except the past. It was astonishing. It was simply amazing. The superiority of the past to the present. Those friends of hers in London, solid persons of her own age, knew the same past that she knew, could talk about it with her, could compare it, as she did with the tinkling present, and in remembering great men, forget for a moment the trivial and barren young people who still, in spite of the war, seemed to litter the world in such numbers. She had not come away from these friends, these conversable, right friends, in order to spend her time in Italy, chatting with three persons of another generation and defective experience. She had come away merely to avoid the treacheries of a London April. It was true, which she had told the two who came to Prince of Wales Terrace, that all she wished to do at San Salvatore was to sit by herself in the sun and remember. They knew this, for she had told them. It had been plainly expressed and clearly understood. Therefore, she had a right to expect them to stay inside the round drawing room and not to emerge interruptingly onto her battlements. But would they? The doubt spoiled her morning. It was only towards lunchtime that she saw a way to be quite safe, and ringing for Francesca, bade her, in slow and majestic Italian, shut the shutters of the glass door of the round drawing room, and then, going with her into the room, which had become darker than ever in consequence. But also, Mrs. Fisher observed to Francesca, who was being voluble, would, because of this very darkness, remain agreeably cool. And after all, there were the numerous slit windows in the walls to let in light. And it was nothing to do with her if they did not let it in. She directed the placing of a cabinet of curios across the door on its inside. This would discourage egress. Then she rang for Domenico and caused him to move one of the flower-filled sarcophagi across the door on its outside. This would discourage ingress. No one, said Domenico hesitating, will be able to use the door. No one, said Mrs. Fisher firmly, will wish to. She then retired to her sitting room, and from a chair placed where she could look straight onto them, gazed at her battlements, secured to her now, completely, with calm pleasure. Being here, she reflected placidly, was much cheaper than being in an hotel, and if she could keep off the others, immeasurably more agreeable. She was paying for her rooms, extremely pleasant rooms. Now that she was arranged in them, £3 a week, which came to about 8 shillings a day. Battlements, watchtower, and all. Where else abroad could she live as well for so little, and have as many baths as she liked, for 8 shillings a day? Of course, she did not yet know what her food would cost, but she would insist on carefulness over that. Or she would also insist on its being carefulness combined with excellence. The two were perfectly compatible if the caterer took pains. With servants' wages, she had ascertained, were negligible, owing to the advantageous exchange, so that there was only the food to cause her anxiety. If she saw signs of extravagance, she would propose that they each hand over a reasonable sum every week to Lady Caroline, which should cover the bills. Any of it that was not used to be returned, and if it were exceeded, the loss to be borne by the caterer. Mrs. Fisher was well off and had the desire for comforts proper to her age, but she disliked expenses. So well off was she that, had she so chosen, she could have lived in an opulent part of London and driven from it and to it in a Rolls Royce. She had no such. It needed more vitality than went with true comfort to deal with the house in an opulent spot and a Rolls Royce. Worries attended such possessions, worries of every kind, crowned by bills. In the sober gloom of Prince of Wales Terrace, she could obscurely enjoy inexpensive yet real comfort without being snatched at by predatory men-servants or collectors for charities. And a taxi stand was at the end of the road. Her annual outlay was small. The house was inherited. Death had furnished it for her. She trod in the dining room on the Turkey carpet of her father's. When she regulated her day by the excellent black marble clock on the mantelpiece which she remembered from childhood. Her walls were entirely covered by the photographs her illustrious deceased friends had given either herself or her father, with their own handwriting across the lower parts of their bodies and the windows. Shrouded by the maroon curtains of all her life were decorated the sides with the self-same aquariums to which she owed her first lessons in sealer, and in which still swam slowly the goldfishes of her youth. Were they the same goldfish? She did not know. Perhaps, like carp, they outlived everybody. Perhaps, on the other hand, behind the deep-sea vegetation provided for them at the bottom, they had, from time to time as the years went by, withdrawn and replaced themselves. Were they, or were they not? She sometimes wondered, contemplating them between the courses of her solitary meals. The same goldfish that had that day been there when Carlyle, how well she remembered it, angrily strode up to them in the middle of some argument with her father that had grown heated, and striking the glass smartly with his fist, had put them to flight, shouting as they fled, "O ye deaf devils! Ye lucky deaf devils! Yeah, I can't hear anything of the blasted, blethering, doddering, glaikit, fool stuff your meister talks, or words to that effect. Dear, great-souled Carlyle. Such natural gushings forth, such true freshness, such real grandeur. Rugged, if you will. Yes, undoubtedly sometimes rugged, and startling in a drawing room, but magnificent. Who was there now to put beside him? Who was there to mention in the same breath? Her father, than whom no one had more flair, said, "Thomas is immortal." And here was this generation of pininess, raising its little voice in doubts, or still worse, not giving itself the trouble to raise it at all. Not. It was incredible, but it had been thus reported to her. Even reading him. Mrs. Fisher did not read him either, but that was different. She had read him. She had certainly read him. Of course she had read him. There was Teufelsdrock. She quite well remembered a tailor called Teufelsdrock. So, like Carlyle to call him that. Yes, she must have read him, though naturally details escaped her. The gong sounded. Lost in reminiscence, Mrs. Fisher had forgotten time, and hastened to her bedroom to wash her hands and smooth her hair. She did not wish to be late and set a bad example, and perhaps find her seat at the head of the table taken. One could put no trust in the manners of the younger generation, especially not in those of that Mrs. Wilkins. She was, however, the first to arrive in the dining room. Francesca, in a white apron, stood ready with an enormous dish of smoking hot, glistening macaroni. But nobody was there to eat it. Mrs. Fisher sat down looking stern, lax. "Serve me," she said to Francesca, who showed a disposition to wait for the others. Francesca served her. Of the party, she liked Mrs. Fisher least. In fact, she did not like her at all. She was the only one of the four ladies who had not yet smiled. True, she was old, true, she was unbeautiful, true, she therefore had no reason to smile, but kind ladies smiled, reason or no. They smiled, not because they were happy, but because they wished to make happy. This one of the four ladies could not then, Francesca, decided, be kind. So she handed her the macaroni, being unable to hide any of her feelings morosely. It was very well cooked, but Mrs. Fisher had never cared for macaroni, especially not this long, worm-shaped variety. She found it difficult to eat, slippery, wriggling off her fork, making her look, she felt, undignified when, having got it as she supposed into her mouth, ends of it yet hung out. Always, too, when she ate it, she was reminded of Mr. Fisher. He had, during their married life, behaved very much like macaroni. He had slipped. He had wriggled. He had made her feel undignified. And when at last she had got them safe, as she thought, there had invariably been little bits of him that still, as it were, hung out. Francesca from the sideboard watched Mrs. Fisher's way with macaroni gloomily, and her gloom deepened when she saw her, at last, take her knife to it and chop it small. Mrs. Fisher really did not know how else to get hold of the stuff. She was aware that knives in this connection were improper, but one did finally lose patience. Macaroni was never allowed to appear on her table in London. Apart from its tiresomeness, she did not even like it, and she would tell Lady Caroline not to order it again. Years of practice, reflected Mrs. Fisher, chopping it up, years in actual living in Italy, would be necessary to learn the exact trick. Browning managed macaroni wonderfully. She remembered watching him one day when he came to lunch with her father, and a dish of it had been ordered as a compliment to his connection with Italy. Fascinating. Away it went in. No chasing round the plate, no slidings off the fork, no subsequent protrusions of loose ends. Just one dig, one whisk, one thrust, one gulf, and lo, yet another poet had been nourished. "Shall I go and seek the young lady?" asked Francesca, unable any longer to look on a good macaroni being cut with a knife. Mrs. Fisher came out of her reminiscent reflections with difficulty. "She knows lunch is at 12:30, she said. "They all know." "She may be asleep," said Francesca. "The other ladies are further away, but this one is not far away." "Beat the gong again, then," said Mrs. Fisher. What manners, she thought. What manners? It was not an hotel, and considerations were due. She must say she was surprised at Mrs. Arbuthnot, who had not looked like somebody unpunctual. Lady Caroline, too. She had seemed amiable and courteous, whatever else she might be. From the other one, of course, she expected nothing. Francesca fetched the gong and took it out into the garden and advanced, beating it as she advanced, close up to Lady Caroline, who, still stretched in her low chair, waited till she had done, and then turned her head, and in the sweetest tones poured forth what appeared to be music, but was really invective. Francesca did not recognize the liquid flow as invective. How was she to when it came out sounding like that? And with her face all smiles, for she could not but smile. When she looked at this young lady, she told her the macaroni was getting cold. "When I do not come to meals, it is because I do not wish to come to meals," said the irritated Scrap, "and you will not in future disturb me." "Is she ill?" asked Francesca, sympathetic, but unable to stop smiling. Never had she seen hair so beautiful, like pure flax, like the hair of northern babes. On such a little head, only blessing could rest. On such a little head, the nimbus of the holiest saints could fitly be placed. Scrap shut her eyes and refused to answer. In this she was injudicious, for its effect was to convince Francesca, who hurried away full of concern to tell Mrs. Fisher that she was indisposed. And Mrs. Fisher, being prevented, she explained, from going out to Lady Caroline herself, because of her stick, sent the two others instead, who had come in at that moment, heated and breathless and full of excuses, while she herself proceeded to the next course, which was a very well-made omelette, bursting most agreeably at both its ends with young green peas. "Serve me," she directed Francesca, who again showed a disposition to wait for the others. "Oh, why won't they leave me alone? Oh, why won't they leave me alone?" Scrap asked herself when she heard more scrunchings on the little pebbles which took the place of grass, and therefore knew someone else was approaching. She kept her eyes tight shut this time. Why should she go into lunch if she didn't want to? This wasn't a private house. She was in no way tangled up in duties towards a tiresome hostess. For all practical purposes, San Salvatore was an hotel, and she ought to be let alone to eat or not to eat, exactly as if she really had been in an hotel. But the unfortunate Scrap could not just sit still, but close her eyes without rousing that desire to stroke and pet in her beholders, with which she was only too familiar. Even the cook had patted her, And now a gentle hand, how well she knew and how much she dreaded gentle hands, was placed on her forehead. "I'm afraid you're not well," said a voice that was not Mrs. Fisher's, and therefore must belong to one of the originals. "I have a headache," murmured Scrap. Perhaps it was best to say that. Perhaps it was the shortest cut to peace. "I'm so sorry," said Mrs. Arbuthnot softly, for it was her hand being gentle. "And said Scrap to herself, "who thought if I came here, I would escape mothers? Don't you think some tea would do you good?" asked Mrs. Arbuthnot tenderly. Tea. The idea was abhorrent to Scrap. In this heat, to be drinking tea in the middle of the day. "No," she murmured. "I expect what would really be best for her," said another voice, "is to be left quiet." How sensible, thought Scrap, and raised the eyelashes of one eye, just enough to peek through and see who was speaking. It was the freckled original. The dark one, then, was the one with the hand. The freckled one rose in her esteem. "But I can't bear to think of you with a headache, and nothing being done for it," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Would a cup of strong black coffee?" Scrap said no more. She waited, motionless and dumb, till Mrs. Arbuthnot should remove her hand. After all, she couldn't stand there all day, and when she went away, she would have to take her hand with her. "I do think," said the freckled one, "that she wants nothing except quiet." And perhaps the freckled one pulled the one with the hand by the sleeve, for the hold on Scrap's forehead relaxed. And after a minute's silence, during which no doubt she was being contemplated, she was always being contemplated, the footsteps began to scrunch the pebbles again, and grew fainter, and were gone. "Lady Caroline has a headache," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, re-entering the dining room and sitting down in her place next to Mrs. Fisher. "I can persuade her to have even a little tea, or some black coffee. Do you know what aspirin is in Italian?" "The proper remedy for headaches," said Mrs. Fisher firmly, "is castor oil." "But she hasn't got a headache," said Mrs. Wilkins. "Carlyle," said Mrs. Fisher, who had finished her omelette and had leisure, while she waited for the next course, to talk, suffered at one period terribly from headaches, and he constantly took castor oil as a remedy. He took it, I should say, almost to excess, and called it, I remember, in his interesting way, the oil of sorrow. My father said it colored for a time his whole attitude to life, his whole philosophy. But that was because he took too much. What Lady Caroline wants is one dose, and one only. It's a mistake to keep on taking a castor oil. "Do you know the Italian for it?" asked Mrs. Arbuthnot. I'm afraid I don't. However, she would know. "You can ask her." "But she hasn't got a headache," repeated Mrs. Wilkins, who was struggling with the macaroni. "She only wants to be let alone." They both looked at her. The word shovel crossed Mrs. Fisher's mind in connection with Mrs. Wilkins' actions at that moment. "Then why should she say she has?" asked Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Because," she is still trying to be polite, "soon she won't try, and the place has got more into her. She'll really be it without trying." "Naturally." "Lotty, you see," explained Mrs. Arbuthnot, smiling to Mrs. Fisher, who sat waiting with a stony patience for her next course. Delayed because Mrs. Wilkins would go on trying to eat the macaroni, which must be less worth eating than ever, now that it was cold. Lotty, the sea has a fury about this place. But Mrs. Fisher had no wish to hear any theory of Mrs. Wilkins's. I'm sure, I don't know, she interrupted, looking severely at Mrs. Wilkins. Why you should assume Lady Caroline is not telling the truth? I don't assume, I know, said Mrs. Wilkins. And pray, how do you know? Asked Mrs. Fisher icily, for Mrs. Wilkins was actually helping herself to more macaroni, offered her officiously and unnecessarily a second time by Francesca. When I was out there just now, I saw inside her. Well, Mrs. Fisher wasn't going to say anything to that. She wasn't going to trouble to reply to downright idiocy. Instead, she sharply rapped the little table gong by her side, though there was Francesca standing at the sideboard, and said, for she would wait no longer for her next course. Serve me. And Francesca, it must have been willful, offered her the macaroni again. Chapter 10. There was no way of getting into or out of the top garden at San Salvatore except through the two glass doors, unfortunately side by side, of the dining room and the hall. A person in the garden who wished to escape unseen could not, for the person to be escaped from would be met on the way. It was a small oblong garden, and concealment was impossible. What trees there were, the Judas tree, the tamarisk, the umbrella pine, grew close to the low parapets. Rows, bushes, gave no real cover. One step to right or left of them in the person wishing to be private was discovered. Only the northwest corner was a little place jetting out from the great wall, a kind of excrescence or loop, no doubt used within the old distrustful days for observation, where it was possible to sit really unseen, because between it and the house was a thick clump of daphne. Scrap, after glancing round to see that no one was looking, got up and carried her chair into this place, stealing away as carefully on tiptoe as those steal whose purpose is sin. There was another excrescence on the walls just like it, at the northeast corner. But this, though the view from it was almost more beautiful, for it you could see the bay and the lovely mountains behind Mezzago, was exposed. No bushes grew near it, nor had it any shade. The northwest loop, then, was where she would sit, and she settled into it, and nestling her head in her cushion, and putting her feet comfortably on the parapet, from whence they appeared to the villagers on the piazza below as two white doves, thought that now indeed she would be safe. Mrs. Fisher found her there, guided by the smell of her cigarette. The incautious Scrap had not thought of that. Mrs. Fisher did not smoke herself, and all the more distinctly could she smell the smoke of others. A virile smell met her directly. She went out into the garden from the dining room after lunch in order to have her coffee. She had bidden Francesca set the coffee in the shade of the house, just outside the glass door, and when Mrs. Wilkins, seeing a table being carried there, reminded her, very officiously and tactlessly, Mrs. Fisher considered that Lady Caroline wanted to be alone. She retorted, and with what propriety, that the garden was for everybody. Into it, accordingly, she went, and was immediately aware that Lady Caroline was smoking. She said to herself, "These modern young women," and proceeded to find her. Her stick, now that lunch was over, being no longer the hindrance to action that it was before her meal had been securely. As Browning once said, surely it was Browning. Yes, she remembered how much diverted she had been roped in. Nobody diverted her now, reflected Mrs. Fisher, making straight for the clump of Daphne. The world had grown very dull, and had entirely lost its sense of humor. Probably they still had their jokes, these people. In fact, she knew they did, for Punch still went on. But how differently it went on, and what jokes. Thackeray, in his inimitable way, would have made mincemeat of this generation, of how much it needed the tonic properties of that astringent pen. It was, of course, unaware. It no longer even held him. At least so she had been informed, in any particular esteem. Well, she could not give it eyes to see, and ears to hear, and a heart to understand. But she could, and would give it, represented and knighted in the form of Lady Caroline, a good dose of honest medicine. "I hear you are not well," she said, standing in the narrow entrance of the loop, and looking down with the inflexible face of one who is determined to do good at the motionless and apparently sleeping Scrap. Mrs. Fisher had a deep voice, very like a man's, for she had been overtaken by that strange masculinity that sometimes pursues a woman during the last lapse of her life. Scrap tried to pretend that she was asleep, but if she had been, her cigarette would not have been held in her fingers, but would have been lying on the ground. She forgot this. Mrs. Fisher did not, and coming inside the loop, sat down on a narrow stone seat built out of the wall. For a little, she could sit on it. For a little, till the chill began to penetrate. She contemplated the figure before her, and undoubtedly a pretty creature, and one that would have had a success at Farringford. Strange, how easily even the greatest men were moved by exteriors. She had seen, with her own eyes, Tennyson turn away from everybody. Turn, positively, his back on a crowd of eminent people assembled to do him honor, and withdraw to the window with a young person nobody had ever heard of, who had been brought there by accident, and whose one and only merit, if it be a merit, that which is conferred by chance, was beauty. Beauty! All over before you can turn round. An affair, one might almost say, of minutes. Well, while it lasted, it did seem able to do what it liked with men. Even husbands were not immune. There had been passages in the life of Mr. Fisher. "I expect the journey has upset you," she said in her deep voice. "What you want is a good dose of some simple medicine. I shall ask Domenico if there is such a thing in the village's castor oil." Scrap opened her eyes and looked straight at Mrs. Fisher. "Ah," said Mrs. Fisher, "I knew you were not asleep. If you had been, you would have let your cigarette fall to the ground." Scrap threw the cigarette over the parapet. "Waste," said Mrs. Fisher. "I don't like smoking for women, but I still less like waste. What does one do with people like this?" Scrap asked herself, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Fisher in what felt to her an indignant scare, but appeared to Mrs. Fisher as really charming docility. "Now, you'll take my advice," said Mrs. Fisher, touched, "and not neglect what may very well turn into an illness. We are in Italy, you know, And one has to be careful. You ought to begin with to go to bed. I never go to bed, snapped Scrap. And it sounded as moving as forlorn as that line spoken years and years ago by an actress playing the part of Poor Joe in dramatized version of Bleak House. I'm always moving on, said Poor Joe in this play, urged to do so by a policeman. And Mrs. Fisher, then a girl, had laid her head on the red velvet parapet of the front row of the dress circle and wept aloud. It was wonderful, Scrap's voice. It had given her, in the 10 years since she came out, all the triumphs that intelligence and wit can have, because it made whatever she said seem memorable. She ought, with a throat formation like that, to have been a singer, but in every kind of music, Scrap was dumb, except this one music of the speaking voice. And what a fascination! What a spell lay in that! Such was the loveliness of her face, and the beauty of her coloring, that there was not a man into whose eyes at the sight of her there did not leap a flame of intensest interest. But when he heard her voice, the flame in that man's eyes was caught and fixed. It was the same with every man, educated and uneducated, old, young, desirable themselves or undesirable, men of her own world and bus conductors, generals and tums. During the war, she had had a perplexing time. Bishops equally, with vergers, round about her confirmation startling occurrences had taken place, wholesome and unwholesome, rich and penniless, brilliant or idiotic. And it made no difference at all what they were, or how long and securely narrowed into the eyes of every one of them. When they saw her, leapt this flame, and when they heard her, it stayed there. Scrap had had enough of this look. It only led to difficulties. At first, it had delighted her. She had been excited, triumphant. To be apparently incapable of doing or saying the wrong thing. To be applauded, listened to, petted, adored wherever she went. And when she came home to find nothing there either, but the most indulgent, proud fondness, why, how extremely pleasant, and so easy too. No preparation necessary for this achievement, no hard work, nothing to learn. She need take no trouble. She had only to appear and presently say something, but gradually experiences gathered round her. After all, she had to take trouble. She had to make efforts, because she discovered with astonishment and rage she had to defend herself. That leaping look, meant that she was going to be grabbed at. Some of those who had it were more humble than others, especially if they were young. But they all, according to their several ability, grabbed. And she who had entered the world so jauntily, with her head in the air, and the completest confidence in anybody whose hair was gray, began to distrust. And then to dislike, and soon to shrink away from, and presently to be indignant. Sometimes it was just as if she didn't belong to herself, wasn't her own at all, but was regarded as a universal thing, a sort of beauty of all work, really men. And she found herself involved in queer, vague quarrels, being curiously hated. Really, women, when the war came, and she flung herself into it along with everybody else, it finished her. Really, generals, the war finished Scrap. It killed the one man she felt safe with, whom she would have married. And it finally disgusted her with love. Since then, she had been embittered. She was struggling as angrily in the sweet stuff of life as a wasp got caught in honey. Just as desperately did she try to unstick her wings. It gave her no pleasure to outdo other women. He didn't want their tiresome men. What could one do with men when one had got them? None of them would talk to her of anything but the things of love, and how foolish and fatiguing that became after a bit. It was as though a healthy person with a normal hunger was given nothing whatever to eat but sugar. Love, the very word made her want to slap somebody. Why should I love you? Why should I? She would ask amazed sometimes when somebody was trying. Somebody was always trying to propose to her. But she never got a real answer, only further incoherence. A deep cynicism took hold of the unhappy Scrap. Her inside grew hoary with disillusionment, while her gracious and charming outside continued to make the world more beautiful. What had the future in it for her? She would not be able, after such a preparation, to take hold of it. She was fit for nothing. She had wasted all this time being beautiful. Presently, she wouldn't be beautiful. And what then? Scrap didn't know what then. It appalled her to wonder, even. Tired as she was of being conspicuous, she was at least used to that. She had never known anything else. And to become inconspicuous, to fade, to grow shabby and dim, would probably be most painful. And once she began, what years and years of it there would be. Imagine, thought Scrap, having most of one's life at the wrong end. Imagine being old for 2 or 3 times as long as being young. Stupid. Everything was stupid. There wasn't a thing she wanted to do. There were thousands of things she didn't want to do. Avoidance, silence, invisibility, if possible unconsciousness. These negations were all she asked for at the moment. And here, even here, she was not allowed a minute's peace. And this absurd woman must come pretending, merely because she wanted to exercise power and make her go to bed, and make her hideous, drink castor oil, that she thought she was ill. I'm sure, said Mrs. Fisher, who felt the cold of the stone beginning to come through and knew she could not sit much longer. We'll do it as reasonable. Your mother would wish. Have you a mother? A faint wonder came into Scrap's eyes. Have you a mother? If ever anybody had a mother, it was Scrap. It had not occurred to her that there could be people who had never heard of her mother. She was one of the major marchionesses, there being, as no one knew better than Scrap, marchionesses, and had held high positions at court. Her father, too, in his day, had been most prominent. His day was a little over. Poor dear, because in the war, he had made some important mistakes, and besides, he was now grown old. Still, there he was, an excessively well-known person. How restful, how extraordinarily restful to have found someone who had never heard of any of her lot, or at least had not yet connected her with them. She began to like Mrs. Fisher. Perhaps the originals didn't know anything about her either. When she first wrote to them and signed her name, that great name of Dester, which twisted in and out of English history like a bloody thread, for its bearers constantly killed, She had taken it for granted that they would know who she was. And at the interview in Shaftesbury Avenue, she was sure they did know, because they hadn't asked, as they otherwise would have, for references. Scrap began to cheer up. If nobody at San Salvatore had ever heard of her, if for a whole month she could shed herself, get right away from everything connected with herself, be allowed really to forget the clinging and the clogging and all the noise, why, perhaps she might make something of herself, after all. Proceed. She might really think, really clear up her mind, really come to some conclusion. What I want to do here, she said, leaning forward in her chair and clasping her hands round her knees, and looking up at Mrs. Fisher, whose seat was higher than hers, almost with animation. So much pleased was she that Mrs. Fisher knew nothing about her, is to come to a conclusion. That's all. It isn't much to want, is it? Just that. She gazed at Mrs. Fisher and thought that almost any conclusion would do. The great thing was to get hold of something, catch something tight, cease to drift. Mrs. Fisher's little eyes surveyed her. I should say, she said, that what a young woman like you wants is a husband and children. Well, that's one of the things I'm going to consider, said Scrap amiably. But I don't think it would be a conclusion. And meanwhile, said Mrs. Fisher, getting up, for the cold of the stone was now through, I shouldn't trouble my head, if I were you, with considerings and conclusions. Women's heads weren't made for thinking, I assure you. I should go to bed and get well. I am well, said Scrap. Then why did you send a message that you were ill? I didn't. Then I've had all the trouble of coming out here for nothing. But wouldn't you prefer coming out and finding me well, and coming out and finding me ill? Then asked Scrap, smiling. Even Mrs. Fisher was caught by the smile. Well, you're a pretty creature, she said forgivingly. It's a pity you weren't born 50 years ago. My friends would have liked looking at you. I'm very glad I wasn't, said Scrap. I dislike being looked at. Absurd, said Mrs. Fisher, growing stern again. That's what you are made for, young women like you. For what else, pray? And I assure you that if my friends had looked at you, you would have been looked at by some very great people. I dislike very great people, said Scrap, frowning. There had been an incident quite recently. Really potentates. What I dislike, said Mrs. Fisher, now as cold as the stone she had got up from, is the pose of the modern young woman. It seems to me pitiful, positively pitiful, in its silliness. And her stick crunching the pebbles, she walked away. That's all right, Scrap said to herself, dropping back into her comfortable position, with her head in the cushion and her feet on the parapet. If only people would go away, she didn't in the least mind why they went. Don't you think darling Scrap is growing a little, just a little, peculiar? Her mother had asked her father a short time before that latest peculiarity of the flight to San Salvatore, uncomfortably struck by the very odd things Scrap said, and the way she had taken to slinking out of reach whenever she could and avoiding everybody, except such a sign of age, quite young men, almost boys. Huh? What? Peculiar. Well, Let her be peculiar if she likes. A woman with her looks can be any damned thing she pleases, was the infatuated answer. I do let her, said her mother meekly. And indeed, if she did not, what difference would it make? Mrs. Fisher was sorry she had bothered about Lady Caroline. She went along the hall towards her private sitting room, and her stick, as she went, struck the stone floor with a vigor in harmony with her feelings. Sheer silliness, these poses. She had no patience with them. Unable to be or do anything of themselves, the young of the present generation tried to achieve a reputation for cleverness by decrying all that was obviously great and obviously good, and by praising everything, however obviously bad, that was different. Apes, thought Mrs. Fisher, roused. Apes. Apes. And in her sitting room she found more apes, or what seemed to her in her present mood more, for there was Mrs. Arbuthnot placidly drinking coffee, while at the writing table she already looked upon as sacred, using her pen, her own pen, brought for her hand alone, Prince of Wales Terrace, sat Mrs. Wilkins writing. At the table, in her room, with her pen. Isn't this a delightful place? Said Mrs. Arbuthnot cordially. We have just discovered it. I'm writing to Mellersh, said Mrs. Wilkins, turning her head, and also cordially, as though Mrs. Fisher thought she cared a straw who she was writing to, and anyhow knew who the person she called Mellersh was. He'll want to know, said Mrs. Wilkins, optimism induced by her surroundings, that I've got here safely. Chapter 11. The sweet smells that were everywhere in San Salvatore were alone enough to produce concord. They came into the sitting room from the flowers on the battlements, and met the ones from the flowers inside the room. And almost Mrs. Wilkins thought Mrs. Wilkins could be seen greeting each other with a holy kiss. Who could be angry in the middle of such gentlenesses? Who could be acquisitive, selfish, in the old rasped London way, in the presence of this bounteous beauty? Yet Mrs. Fisher seemed to be all three of these things. There was so much beauty, so much more than enough for everyone, but it did appear to be a vain activity to try and make a corner in it. Yet Mrs. Fisher was trying to make a corner in it, and had railed off a portion for her exclusive use. Well, she would get over that presently. She would get over it inevitably. Mrs. Wilkins was sure, after a day or two in the extraordinary atmosphere of peace in that place. Meanwhile, she obviously hadn't even begun to get over it. She stood looking at her and Rose with an expression that appeared to be one of anger. Anger. Fancy. Silly, old nerve-racked London feelings, thought Mrs. Wilkins, whose eyes saw the room full of kisses, and everybody in it being kissed. Mrs. Fisher as copiously as she herself and Rose. You don't like us being here, said Mrs. Wilkins, getting up and at once, after her mater, fixing on the truth. Why? I should have thought, said Mrs. Fisher, leaning on her stick. You could have seen that it is my room. You mean because of the photographs, said Mrs. Wilkins. Mrs. Arbuthnot, who was a little red and surprised, got up, too. And the notepaper, said Mrs. Fisher. Notepaper, with my London address on it. That pen, she pointed. It was still in Mrs. Wilkins's hand. Is yours. I'm very sorry, said Mrs. Wilkins, laying it on the table. And she added, smiling, that it had just been writing some very amiable things. But why? Asked Mrs. Arbuthnot, who found herself unable to acquiesce in Mrs. Fisher's arrangements without at least a gentle struggle. Ought we not to be here? It's a sitting room. There is another one, said Mrs. Fisher. You and your friend cannot sit in 2 rooms at once. And if I have no wish to disturb you in yours, I am unable to see why you should wish to disturb me in mine. But why? Began Mrs. Arbuthnot again. It's quite natural, Mrs. Wilkins interrupted, for Rose was looking stubborn. And turning to Mrs. Fisher, she said that, although sharing things with friends was pleasant, she could understand that Mrs. Fisher, still steeped in the Prince of Wales Terrace attitude to life, did not yet want to, but that she would get rid of that after a bit and feel quite different. Soon you'll want us to share, said Mrs. Wilkins reassuringly. Why, you may even get so far as asking me to use your pen, if you knew I haven't got one. Mrs. Fisher was moved almost beyond control by this speech. To have a ramshackle young woman from Hampstead patting her on the back, as it were, in breezy certitude that quite soon she would improve, stirred her more deeply than anything had stirred her since her first discovery that Mr. Fisher was not what he seemed. Mrs. Wilkins must certainly be curbed. But how? There was a curious imperviousness about her. At that moment, for instance, she was smiling as pleasantly and with as unclouded a face as if she were saying nothing in the least impertinent. Would she know she was being curbed? If she didn't know, if she were too tough to feel it, then what? Nothing.
Except avoidance. Except precisely one's own private sitting room.
I'm an old woman, said Mrs. Fisher, and I need a room to myself. I cannot get about because of my stick. As I cannot get about, I have to sit. Why should I not sit quietly and undisturbed, as I told you in London I intended to? If people are to come in and out all day long, chattering and leaving doors open, you will have broken the agreement, which was that I was to be quiet. But we haven't the least wish, began Mrs. Arbuthnot, who was again cut short by Mrs. Wilkins. We're only too glad, said Mrs. Wilkins, for you to have this room if it makes you happy. We didn't know about it. That's all. We wouldn't have come in if we had, not till you invited us, anyhow. I expect. She finished looking down cheerfully at Mrs. Fisher. You soon will. And picking up her letter, she took Mrs. Arbuthnot's hand and drew her towards the door. Mrs. Arbuthnot did not want to go. She, a mildest of women, was filled with a curious and surely unchristian desire to stay and fight. Not, of course, really, nor even with any definitely aggressive words. No, she only wanted to reason with Mrs. Fisher, and reason patiently. But she did feel that something ought to be said, and that she ought not to allow herself to be rated, and turned out as if she were a schoolgirl caught in ill behavior by authority. Mrs. Wilkins, however, drew her firmly to and through the door. And once again, Rose wondered at Lotty, at her balance, her sweet and equable temper. She, who in England had been such a thing of gusts. From the moment they got into Italy, it was Lotty who seemed the elder. She certainly was very happy, blissful in fact. Did happiness so completely protect one? Did it make one so untouchable, so wise? Rose was happy herself, but not anything like so happy. Evidently not. For not only did she want to fight Mrs. Fisher, but she wanted something else. Something more than this lovely place. Something to complete it. She wanted Frederick. For the first time in her life, she was surrounded by perfect beauty, and her one thought was to show it to him, to share it with him. She wanted Frederick. She yearned for Frederick. Ah, if only Frederick. Poor old thing, said Mrs. Wilkins, shutting the door gently on Mrs. Fisher in her triumph. Fancy on a day like this. She's a very rude old thing, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. She'll get over that. I'm sorry we chose just her room to go and sit in. It's much the nicest, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. And it isn't hers. Oh, but there are lots of other places. And she's such a poor old thing. Let her have the room. Whatever doesn't matter. And Mrs. Wilkins said she was going down to the village to find out where the post office was, and post her letter to Mellersh. When would Rose go too? I've been thinking about Meller, said Mrs. Wilkins as they walked, one behind the other, down the narrow zigzag path up which they had climbed in the rain the night before. And she went first. And Mrs. Arbuthnot quite naturally now followed. In England, it had been the other way about. Lotty, timid, hesitating, except when she burst out so awkwardly, getting behind the calm and reasonable Rose whenever she could. I've been thinking about Mellersh, repeated Mrs. Wilkins over her shoulder, as Rose seemed not to have heard. Have you? Said Rose, a faint distaste in her voice, for her experiences with Mellersh had not been of a kind to make her enjoy remembering him. She had deceived Mellersh. Therefore, she didn't like him. She was unconscious that this was the reason of her dislike, and thought it was that there didn't seem to be much, if any, of the grace of God about him. And yet, how wrong to feel that. She rebuked herself. And how presumptuous. No doubt, Roddy's husband was far, far nearer to God than she herself was ever likely to be. Still, she didn't like him. I've been a mean dog, said Mrs. Wilkins. A what? Asked Mrs. Arbuthnot, incredulous of her hearing. All this coming away and leaving him in that dreary place, though I rollick in heaven. He had planned to take me to Italy for Easter himself. Did I tell you? No, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. And indeed, she had discouraged talk about husbands. Whenever Lottie had begun to blurt out things, she had swiftly changed the conversation. One husband led to another in conversation as well as in life, she felt. And she would not talk of Frederick. Beyond the bare fact that he was there, he had not been mentioned. Mellersh had to be mentioned because of his obstructiveness. But she had carefully kept him from overflowing outside the limits of necessity. Well, he did, said Mrs. Wilkins. He had never done such a thing in his life before, and I was horrified. Fancy, just as I had planned to come to it myself. She paused on the path and looked up at Rose. Yes, said Rose, trying to think of something else to talk about. Now you see why I say I've been a mean dog. He had planned a holiday in Italy with me, and I had planned a holiday in Italy, leaving him at home. I think, she went on, her eyes fixed on Rose's face, Mellersh has every reason to be both angry and hurt. Mrs. Arbuthnot was astonished. The extraordinary quickness with which, hour by hour, Under her very eyes, Lottie became more selfless, disconcerted her. He was turning into something surprisingly like a saint. Here she was now being affectionate about Mellersh. Mellersh, who only that morning, while they hung their feet into the sea, had seemed a mere iridescence. Lottie had told her, a thing of gauze. That was only that morning. And by the time they had lunch, Lottie had developed so far as to have got him solid enough again to write to. And now, a few minutes later, she was announcing that he had every reason to be angry with her and hurt in that she herself had been. The language was unusual, but it did express real penitence. A mean dog. Rose stared at her, astonished. If she went on like this, soon a nimbus might be expected round her head was there already. If one didn't know, it was the sun through the tree, trunks catching her sandy hair. A great desire to love and be friends, to love everybody, to be friends with everybody, seemed to be invading Lottie. A desire for sheer goodness. Rose's own experience was that goodness, the state of being good, was only reached with difficulty and pain. It took a long time to get to it. In fact, one never did get to it. Or, if for a flashing instant one did, it was only for a flashing instant. Desperate perseverance was needed to struggle along its path, and all the way was dotted with doubts. Lottie simply flew along. She had certainly, thought Rose, not got rid of her impetuousness. It had nearly taken another direction. She was now impetuously becoming a sin. Could one really attain goodness so violently? Wouldn't there be an equally violent reaction? I shouldn't, said Rose with caution, looking down into Lottie's bright eyes. The path was steep, so that Lottie was well below her. I shouldn't be sure of that too quickly. But I am sure of it, and I've written and told him so. Rose stayed. Why? But only this morning, she began. It's all in this. Interrupted Lottie, tapping the envelope and looking pleased. What? Everything. You mean about the advertisement and my savings being spent? Oh, no, not yet. But I'll tell him all that when he comes. When he comes, repeated Rose. I've invited him to come and stay with us. Rose could only go on staring. It's the least I could do. Besides, look at this. Lottie waved her hand. Disgusting not to share it. I was a mean dog to go off and leave him. But no dog I've ever heard of was ever as mean as I'd be if I didn't try and persuade Mellersh to come out and enjoy this too. It's Bear's decency that he should have some of the fun out of my nest egg. After all, he has housed me and fed me for years. One shouldn't be churlish. But do you think he'll come? Oh, I hope so, said Lottie with the utmost earnestness, and added, poor lamb. At that Rose felt she would like to sit down. Mellersh a poor lamb? That same Mellersh who a few hours before was mere shimmer. There was a seat at the bend of the path, and Rose went to it and sat down. She wished to get her breath, gain time. If she had time, she might perhaps be able to catch up the leaping Lottie, and perhaps be able to stop her before she committed herself to what she probably presently would be sorry for. Mellersh at San Salvatore, Mellersh, from whom Lottie had taken such pains so recently to escape. I see him here, said Lottie. As if in answer to her thoughts, Rose looked at her with real concern. For every time Lottie said, in that convinced voice, "I see," what she saw came true. Then it was to be supposed that Mr. Wilkins, too, would presently come true. "I wish," said Rose anxiously, "I understood you." "Don't try," said Lottie, smiling. "But I must, because I love you." "Dear Rose," said Lottie, swiftly bending down and kissing her. "You're so quick," said Rose. "I can't follow your developments. I can't keep touch. It was what happened with Frater." She broke off and looked frightened. "The whole idea of our coming here," she went on again, as Lottie didn't seem to have noticed, "was to get away, wasn't it? Well, we've got away. And now, after only a single day of it, you want to write to the very people." She stopped. "The very people we were getting away from?" finished Lottie. "It's quite true. It seems idiotically illogical. But I'm so happy. I'm so well. I feel so fearfully wholesome. This place, why, makes me feel flooded with love." And she stared down at Rose in a kind of radiant surprise. Rose was silent a moment. Then she said, "And do you think it will have the same effect on Mr. Wilkins?" Lottie laughed. "I don't know," she said. "But even if it doesn't, there's enough love about to flood 50 Mr. Wilkinses, as you call him. The great thing is to have lots of love about. I don't see," she went on, "at least I don't see here, though I did at home, that it matters who loves, as long as somebody does. I was a stingy beast at home, and used to measure and count. I had a queer obsession about justice, as though justice mattered, as though justice can really be distinguished from vengeance. It's only love that's any good. At home, I wouldn't love Mellersh unless he loved me back, exactly as much. Absolute fairness. Did you ever? As he didn't, neither did I. And the aridity of that house. The aridity." Rose said nothing. She was bewildered by Lottie. One odd effect of San Salvatore on her rapidly developing friend was her sudden free use of robust words. She had not used them in Hampstead. Beast and dog were more robust than Hampstead cared about. In words, too, Lottie had come unchained. But how, she lished, well, how Rose lished, that she too could write to her husband and say, "Come." The Wilkins menage, however pompous Mellersh might be, and he had seemed to Rose pompous, was on a healthier, more natural footing than hers. Lottie could write to Mellersh and would get an answer. She couldn't write to Frederick, for only too well did she know he wouldn't answer. At least he might answer a hurried scribble, showing how much bored he was at doing it, with perfunctory thanks for her letter. But that would be worse than no answer at all, for his handwriting, her name on an envelope addressed by him, stabbed her heart. Too acutely did it bring back the letters of their beginnings together, the letters from him so desolate with separation, so aching with love and longing, to see, apparently, one of these very same letters, arrive and open it and find, "Dear Rose, thanks for letter. Glad you're having a good time. Don't hurry back. Say if you want any money, Everything going splendidly here. Yours, Frederick. Oh, it couldn't be borne. I don't think I'll come down to the village with you today," she said, looking up at Lotty with eyes suddenly gone dim. "I think I want to think." "All right," said Lotty, at once starting off briskly down the path. "But don't think too long," she called back over her shoulder. "Write and invite him at once." "Invite whom?" asked Rose, startled. "Your husband." Chapter 12. At the evening meal, which was the first time the whole four sat round the dining room table together, Scrap appeared. She appeared quite punctually, and in one of those wrappers or tea gowns which are sometimes described as ravishing. This one really was ravishing. It certainly ravished Mrs. Wilkins, who could not take her eyes off the enchanting figure opposite. It was a shell-pink garment, and clung to the adorable Scrap as though it too loved her. "What a beautiful dress!" exclaimed Mrs. Wilkins eagerly. "What, this old rag?" said Scrap, glancing down at it, as if to see which one she had got on. "I've had it 100 years. And she concentrated on her soup. "You must be very cold in it," said Mrs. Fisher, thin-lipped, for it showed a great deal of Scrap, the whole of her arms, for instance, and even where it covered her up, it was so thin that you still saw her. "Who? Me?" said Scrap, looking up a moment. "Oh, no." And she continued her soup. "You mustn't catch a chill, you know," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, feeling that such loveliness must at all costs be preserved unharmed. "There's a great difference here when the sun goes down." "I'm quite warm," said Scrap, industriously eating her soup. "You look as if you had nothing at all, and underneath," said Mrs. Fisher. "I haven't. At least, hardly anything," said Scrap, finishing her soup. "How very imprudent," said Mrs. Fisher, "and how highly improper." Whereupon Scrap stared at her. Mrs. Fisher had arrived at dinner feeling friendly towards Lady Caroline. She at least had not intruded into her room and sat at her table and written with her pen. She did, Mrs. Fisher had supposed, know how to behave. Now it appeared that she did not know, for was this behaving, to come dressed, no undressed, like that, to a meal. Such behavior was not only exceedingly improper, but also most inconsiderate. For the indelicate creature would certainly catch a chill, and then infect the entire party. Mrs. Fisher had a great objection to other people's chills. They were always the fruit of folly. And then they were handed on to her, who had done nothing at all to deserve them. Bird-brained, thought Mrs. Fisher, sternly contemplating Lady Caroline. Not an idea in her head, except vanity. "But there are no men here," said Mrs. Wilkins. "So how can it be improper?" "Have you noticed," she inquired of Mrs. Fisher, who endeavored to pretend she did not hear, "how difficult it is to be improper without men?" Mrs. Fisher neither answered her nor looked at her. But Scrap looked at her, and did that with her mouth, which in any other mouth would have been a faint grin. Seen from without, across the bowl of nasturtiums, it was the most beautiful of brief and dimpled smiles. She had a very alive sort of face. That one, thought Scrap, observing Mrs. Wilkins, with the dawn of interest. It was rather like a field of corn, swept by lights and shadows. Both she and the dark one, Scrap noticed, had changed their clothes, but only in order to put on silk jumpers. The same amount of trouble would have been enough to dress them properly, reflected Scrap. Naturally, they looked like nothing on earth in the jumpers. It didn't matter what Mrs. Fisher wore. Indeed, the only thing for her, short of plumes and ermine, was what she did wear. But these others were quite young still, and quite attractive. They really, definitely had faces. How different life would be for them if they made the most of themselves instead of the least. And yet, Scrap was suddenly bored and turned away her thoughts and absently ate toast. What did it matter? If you did make the best of yourself, you only collected people round you who ended by wanting to grab. I've had the most wonderful day, began Mrs. Wilkins, her eyes shining. Scrap lowered hers. Oh, she thought, she's gonna gush. As though anybody were interested in her day, thought Mrs. Fisher, lowering hers also. In fact, whenever Mrs. Wilkins spoke, Mrs. Fisher deliberately cast down her eyes. Thus would she mark her disapproval. Besides, it seemed the only safe thing to do with her eyes, for no one could tell what the uncurbed creature would say next. That which she had just said, for instance, about men, addressed to her. What could she mean? Better not conjecture, thought Mrs. Fisher. And her eyes, though cast down, yet saw Lady Caroline stretch out her hand to the Chianti flask and fill her glass again. Again. She had done it once already, and the fish was only just going out of the room. Mrs. Fisher could see that the other respectable member of the party, Mrs. Arbuthnot, was noticing it too. Mrs. Arbuthnot was, she hoped and believed, respectable and well-meaning. It is true she also had invaded her sitting room, but no doubt she had been dragged there by the other one. And Mrs. Fisher had little, if anything, against a Mrs. Arbuthnot, and observed with approval that she only drank water. That was as it should be. So indeed, to give her her dues, did the freckled one, and very right at their age. She herself drank wine, but with what moderation? One meal, one glass, and she was 65, and might properly, and even beneficially, have had at least two. That, she said to Lady Caroline, cutting right across what Mrs. Wilkins was telling them about her wonderful day, and indicating the wine glass, is very bad for you. Lady Caroline, however, could not have heard, for she continued to sit, her elbow on the table, and listen to what Mrs. Wilkins was saying. And what was it she was saying? She had invited somebody to come and stay. A man. Mrs. Fisher could not credit her ears. Yet, it evidently was a man, for she spoke of the person as he, suddenly and for the first time. But then, this was most important. Mrs. Fisher addressed Mrs. Wilkins directly. She was 65 and cared very little what sorts of women she happened to be with for a month. But if the women were to be mixed with men, it was a different proposition altogether. She was not going to be made a cat's paw of. She had not come out there to sanction by her presence what used in her day to be called fast behavior. Sanction. Nothing had been said at the interview in London about men. If there had been, she would have declined, of course, to come. What is his name? Asked Mrs. Fisher, abruptly interposing. Mrs. Wilkins turned to her with a slight surprise. Wilkins, she said. Wilkins. Yes. Your name? And his a relation, not blood. The connection? A husband. Mrs. Fisher once more cast down her eyes. She could not talk to Mrs. Wilkins. There was something about the things she said. A husband? Suggesting one of many. Always that unseemly twist to everything. Why could she not say, my husband? Besides, Mrs. Fisher had she herself, knew not for what reason, taken both the Hampstead young women for widows, war ones. There had been an absence of mention of husbands at the interview, which would not, she considered, be natural if such persons did after all exist. And if a husband was not a relation, who was? Not blood, but a way to talk. Why, a husband was the first of all relations. How well she remembered Ruskin. No, it was not Ruskin. It was the Bible that said a man should leave his father and mother and cleave only to his wife, showing that she became by marriage an even more than blood relation. And if the husband's father and mother were to be nothing to him compared to his wife, how much less than nothing ought the wife's father and mother be to her, compared to her husband? She herself had been unable to leave her father and mother in order to cleave to Mr. Fisher, because they were no longer, when she married, alive. But she certainly would have left them if they had been there to leave. Not blood, indeed. Silly talk. The dinner was very good. Succulence succeeded succulence. Costanza had determined to do as she chose in the matter of cream and eggs the first week, and see what happened at the end of it, when the bills had to be paid. Her experience of the English was that they were quiet about bills. They were shy of words. They believed readily. Besides, who was the mistress here? In the absence of a definite one, it was occurred to Costanza that she might as well be the mistress herself. So she did, and she chose about the dinner, and it was very good. The four, however, were so much preoccupied by their own conversation that they ate it without noticing how good it was. Even Mrs. Fisher, she who in such matters was manly, did not notice. The entire excellent cooking was to heart, as though it were not, which shows how much she must have been stirred. She was stirred. It was that Mrs. Wilkins. She was enough to stir anybody. And she was undoubtedly encouraged by Lady Caroline, who in her turn was no doubt influenced by the Chianti. Mrs. Fisher was very glad there were no men present, for they certainly would have been foolish about Lady Caroline. She was precisely the sort of young woman to unbalance them. Especially, Mrs. Fisher recognized at that moment. Perhaps it was the Chianti momentarily intensifying her personality, but she was undeniably most attractive. And there were few things Mrs. Fisher disliked more than having to look on while sensible, intelligent men, who the moment before were talking seriously and interestingly about real matters, became nearly foolish and simpering. She had seen them actually simpering, just because and walked, a bit of bird-brained beauty. Even Mr. Gladstone, that great, wise statesman, whose hand had once rested for an unforgettable moment solemnly on her head, would have, she felt, on perceiving Lady Caroline left off talking sense and horribly embarked on badinage. You see, Mrs. Wilkins said, a silly trick, that with which she mostly began her sentences. Mrs. Fisher each time wished to say, "Pardon me, I do not see. I hear. But why trouble?" "You see," said Mrs. Wilkins, leaning across towards Lady Caroline, "we arranged, didn't we, in London, that if any of us wanted to, we could each invite one guest. So now I'm doing it." "I don't remember that," said Mrs. Fisher, her eyes on her plate. "Oh, yes, we did, didn't we, Rose?" "Yes, I remember," said Lady Caroline. "Only it seems so incredible that one could ever want to. One's whole idea was to get away from one's friends and one's husbands. Again, that unseemly plural. But how altogether unseemly, thought Mrs. Fisher. Such implications. Mrs. Arbuthnot clearly thought so too, for she had turned red. "And family affection," said Lady Caroline. Or was it the Chianti speaking? Surely it was the Chianti. "And the want of family affection," said Mrs. Wilkins. What a light she was throwing on her home life and real character. "That wouldn't be so bad," said Lady Caroline. "I'd stay with that. It would give one room." "Oh, no, no, it's dreadful," cried Mrs. Wilkins. "It's as if one had no clothes on." "But I like that," said Lady Caroline. "Really," said Mrs. Fisher, "it's a divine feeling. Getting rid of things," said Lady Caroline, who was talking altogether to Mrs. Wilkins and paid no attention to the other two. "Oh, but in the bitter wind, to have nothing on, and know there never will be anything on, and you going to get colder and colder, till at last you die of it. That's what it was like, living with somebody who didn't love one." These confidences, thought Mrs. Fisher, and no excuse whatever for Mrs. Wilkins, who was making them entirely on plain water. Mrs. Arbuthnot, judging from her face, quite shared Mrs. Fisher's disapproval. She was fidgeting. "But didn't he?" asked Lady Caroline, every bit as shamelessly unreticent as Mrs. Wilkins. "Mellersh. He showed no signs of it." "Delicious," murmured Lady Caroline. "Really," said Mrs. Fisher, "I didn't think it was at all delicious. I was miserable. And now, since I've been here, I simply stare at myself being miserable. As miserable as that. And about Mellersh, you mean he wasn't worth it?" "Really," said Mrs. Fisher, "no, I don't. I mean, I suddenly got well." Lady Caroline, slowly twisting the stem of her glass in her fingers, scrutinized the lit-up face opposite. "And now I'm well, I find. I can't sit here and gloat all to myself. I can't be happy shutting him out. I must share." I understand exactly what the blessed damozel felt like. "What was the blessed damozel?" asked Scrap. "Really," said Mrs. Fisher, and with such emphasis this time that Lady Caroline turned to her. "Ought I to know?" she asked. "I don't know any natural history. It sounds like a bird." "It is a poem," said Mrs. Fisher with extraordinary frost. "Oh," said Scrap. "I'll lend it to you," said Mrs. Wilkins, over whose face laughter rippled. "No," said Scrap. "And its author," said Mrs. Fisher icily, though not perhaps quite what one would have wished him to be, "was frequently at my father's table." "What a bore for you," said Scrap. "That's what mother's always doing, inviting authors. I hate authors. I wouldn't mind them so much if they didn't write books." "Go on, about Mellersh," she said, turning to Mrs. Wilkins. Really, said Mrs. Fisher. All those empty beds, said Mrs. Wilkins. What empty beds? Asked Scrap. The ones in this house. Why, of course, they each ought to have somebody happy inside them. 8 beds, and only 4 people. It's dreadful, dreadful to be so greedy and keep everything just for oneself. I want Rose to ask her husband out, too. You and Mrs. Fisher haven't got husbands, but why not give some friend a glorious time? Rose bit her lip. She turned red. She turned pale. If only Lotty would keep quiet, she thought. It was all very well to have suddenly become a saint and want to love everybody, but need she be so tactless? Rose felt that all her poor sore places were being danced on. If only Lotty would keep quiet, and Mrs. Fisher, with even greater frostiness than that with which she had received Lady Caroline's ignorance of the blessed demoiselle, said, There is only one unoccupied bedroom in this house. Only one, echoed Mrs. Wilkins, astonished. Then who are in all the others? We are, said Mrs. Fisher, but we're not in all the bedrooms. There must be at least 6. That leaves 2 over. And the owner told us there were 8 beds, didn't he, Rose? There are 6 bedrooms, said Mrs. Fisher, for both she and Lady Caroline had thoroughly searched the house on arriving in order to see which part of it they would be most comfortable in. And they both knew that there were 6 bedrooms, 2 of which were very small. And in one of these small ones, Francesca slept in the company of a chair and a chest of drawers, and the other, similarly furnished, was empty. Mrs. Wilkins and Mrs. Arbuthnot had hardly looked at the house, having spent most of their time out of doors, gaping at the scenery, and had, in the agitated inattentiveness of their minds, when first they began negotiating for San Salvatore, got into their heads that the 8 beds of which the owner spoke were the same as 8 bedrooms, which they were not. There were indeed 8 beds, but 4 of them were in Mrs. Wilkins's and Mrs. Arbuthnot's rooms. There are 6 bedrooms, repeated Mrs. Fisher. We have 4. Francesca has the 5th, and the 6th is empty. So that, said Scrap, however kind we feel we would be, if we could. We can't. Isn't it fortunate? But then there's only room for 1, said Mrs. Wilkins, looking round at the 3 faces. Yes, and you've got him, said Scrap. Mrs. Wilkins was taken aback. This question of the beds was unexpected. In inviting Mellersh, she had intended to put him in one of the 4 spare rooms that she imagined were there. When there were plenty of rooms and enough servants, there was no reason why they should, as they did in their small 2-servanted house at home, share the same one. Love, even universal love, the kind of love with which she felt herself flooded, should not be tried. Much patience and self-effacement were needed for successful married sleep. Placidity, a steady faith, these 2 were needed. She was sure she would be much fonder of Mellersh, and he not mind her nearly so much if they were not shut up together at night. If, in the morning, they could meet with the cheery affection of friends between whom lies no shadow of differences about the window or the washing arrangements, or of absurd little choke-down resentments at something that had seemed to one of them unfair. Her happiness, she felt, and her ability to be friends with everybody was the result of her sudden new freedom and its peace. Would there be that sense of freedom, that peace, after a night shut up with Mellersh? Would she be able in the morning to be full towards him, as she was at that moment full of nothing at all but loving kindness? After all, she hadn't been very long in heaven. Suppose she hadn't been in it long enough for her to become fixed and blandness. And only that morning, what an extraordinary joy it had been to find herself alone when she woke, and able to pull the bedclothes any way she liked. Francesca had to measure. She was so much absorbed that she did not notice the pudding. If that Mrs. Wilkins distractedly helping herself, I share my room with Mellersh vehicle, I risk losing all I now feel about him. If, on the other hand, I put him in the one spare room, I prevent Mrs. Fisher and Lady Caroline from giving somebody a treat. True, they don't seem to want to at present, but at any moment in this place, one or the other of them may be seized with the desire to make somebody happy. And then they wouldn't be able to, because of Mellersh. What a problem, she said aloud. Her eyebrows puckered. What is ASCREP? Where to put Mellersh? Scrap stared. Why isn't one room enough for him? She asked. Oh yes, quite. But then there won't be any room left at all. Any room for somebody you may want to invite. I shan't want to, said Scrap. Or you, said Mrs. Wilkins to Mrs. Fisher. Rose, of course, doesn't count. I'm sure she would like sharing her room with her husband. It's written all over her. Really, said Mrs. Fisher. Really what? Asked Mrs. Wilkins, turning hopefully to her, for she thought the word this time was the preliminary to a helpful suggestion. It was not. It stood by itself. It was, as before, near frost. Challenged, however, Mrs. Fisher did fasten it onto a sentence. Really am I to understand, she asked, that you propose to reserve the one spare room for the exclusive use of your own family? He isn't my own family, said Mrs. Wilkins. He's my husband. You see, I see nothing. Mrs. Fisher could not this time refrain from interrupting, for what an intolerable trick. At the most, I hear, and not reluctantly. But Mrs. Wilkins, as impervious to rebuke as Mrs. Fisher had feared, immediately repeated the tiresome formula and launched out into a long and excessively indelicate speech about the best place for the person she called Mellersh to sleep in. Mrs. Fisher, remembering the Thomases and Johns and Alfreds and Roberts of her day, plain names that yet had all become glorious, but its sheer affectation to be christened Mellersh. It seemed Mrs. Wilkins' husband, and therefore his place was clearly indicated. Why this talk? She herself, as if foreseeing his arrival, had had a second bed put in Mrs. Wilkins's room. There were certain things in life which were never talked about, but only done. Most things connected with husbands were not talked about. And to have a whole dinner table taken up with a discussion as to where one of them should sleep was an affront to the decencies. How and where husbands slept should be known only to their wives. Sometimes it was not known to them, and then the marriage had less happy moments. But these moments were not talked about either. The decencies continued to be preserved. At least it was so in her day. The unfurl of what he found a new criminal character is holding Mrs. Wilkins. He thinks he would know any person for travel to me. She might have succeeded in imposing propriety and changing the conversation if it had not been for Lady Caroline. Lady Caroline encouraged Mrs. Wilkins and threw herself into the discussion with every bit as much unreserve as Mrs. Wilkins herself. No doubt she was impelled on this occasion by Chianti, but whatever the reason, there it was. And characteristically, Lady Caroline was all for Mr. Wilkins being given the solitary spare room. She took that for granted. Any other arrangement would be impossible, she said. Her expression was barbarous. Had she never read her Bible, Mrs. Fisher was tempted to inquire. And the two shall be one flesh, clearly also then one room. But Mrs. Fisher did not inquire. She did not care even to allude to such texts to someone unmarried. However, there was one way she could force Mr. Wilkins into his proper place and save the situation. And she could say that she herself intended to invite a friend. It was her right. They had all said so. Apart from propriety, it was monstrous that Mrs. Wilkins should want to monopolize the one spare room, when in her own room was everything necessary for her husband. Perhaps she really would invite somebody. Not invite, but suggest coming. There was Kate Lumley, for instance. My Kate could perfectly afford to come and pay her share. Someone, and she was of her own period, and knew and had known. Most of the people she herself knew and had known. Kate, of course, had only been on the fringe. She used to be asked only to the big parties, not to the small ones, and she still was only on the fringe. There were some people who never got off the fringe, and Kate was one. Often, however, such people were more permanently agreeable to be with than the others, in that they remained grateful. Yes, she might really consider Kate. The poor soul had never married, but then everybody could not expect to marry. And she was quite comfortably off, not too comfortably, but just comfortably enough to pay her own expenses if she came, and yet be grateful. Yes, Kate was the solution. If she came, at one stroke, Miss Fisher saw, would the Wilkinses be regularized, and Mrs. Wilkins be prevented from having more than her share of the rooms. Also, Mrs. Fisher would save herself from isolation, spiritual isolation. She desired physical isolation between meals, but she disliked that isolation which is of the spirit. Such isolation would, she feared, certainly be hers with these three alien-minded young women. Even Mrs. Arbuthnot was, owing to her friendship with Mrs. Wilkins, necessarily alien-minded. In Kate, she would have a support. Kate, without intruding on her sitting room, for Kate was tractable, would be there at meals to support her. Mrs. Fisher said nothing at the moment, but presently in the drawing room, when they were gathered round the wood fire, she had discovered there was no fireplace in her own sitting room, and therefore she would after all be forced, so long as the evening remained cool, to spend them in the other room. Presently, while Francesco was handing coffee round, and Lady Caroline was poisoning the air with smoke, Mrs. Wilkins, looking relieved and pleased, said, "Well, if nobody really wants that room, and wouldn't use it anyhow, I shall be very glad if Mellersh may have it." "Of course he must have it," said Lady Caroline. Then Mrs. Fisher spoke. "I have a friend," she said in her deep voice, and sudden silence fell upon the others. "Kate Lumley," said Mrs. Fisher. Nobody spoke. "Perhaps," continued Mrs. Fisher, addressing Lady Caroline, "you know her?" No, Lady Caroline did not know Kate Lumley. And Mrs. Fisher without asking the others if they did, for she was sure they knew no one, proceeded. "I wish to invite her to join me," said Mrs. Fisher. Complete silence. "Then," Scrap said, turning to Mrs. Wilkins, "that settles Mellersh. "It settles the question of Mr. Wilkins," said Mrs. Fisher, "although I am unable to understand that there should ever have been a question in the only way that is right." "I'm afraid you're in for it, then," said Lady Caroline, again to Mrs. Wilkins. "Unless," she added, "he can't come." But Mrs. Wilkins, her brow perturbed, for suppose after all she were not yet quite stable in heaven, could only say, a little uneasily, "I see him here."